Picture this. It is August 7th, 718, and you are standing on the walls of Constantinople, watching the largest invasion fleet in human history darken the horizon. 2,600 ships. You count them until your eyes blur. Behind those sails are 180,000 men who have come to erase your city from existence. The Umayyad Caliphate, which conquered half the known world in less than a century, has finally arrived at the gates of the Christian capital. Their generals are so confident that they have brought siege equipment for a year-long blockade and supply ships loaded with enough grain to feed an army until the walls crumble to dust. You look behind you at your own forces. Fewer than 50,000 defenders, many of them civilians who have never held a sword. Your emperor, Leo III, has been on the throne for barely 2 years. The experts across Europe are writing your obituary. The fall of Constantinople is not a question of if, but when. Muslim chroniclers are already composing victory poems. They call this operation the final conquest, the blow that will shatter Christendom forever and open the road to Rome itself. But here is what those 2,600 ships do not know. Here is what 180,000 soldiers are about to discover in the most brutal way imaginable. They are not sailing toward a siege. They are sailing into a death trap designed by the most ruthless military mind of the medieval world. And the weapon that will destroy them is not swords or arrows or catapults. It is something far more terrifying. It is a liquid that burns on water, a chemical horror that turns the sea itself into a funeral pyre. Before diving into the forgotten story of how Byzantium turned the tide against Islamic conquest, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you are listening from. I find it incredible that we are exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Now, wipe the sweat from your eyes and look at what is coming for you. Because in the next 12 months, this city will become a graveyard. The question is, whose graveyard it will be. To understand why the fall of Constantinople in 1718 seemed inevitable, you have to understand the speed and scale of Islamic expansion. This was not a gradual conquest, it was a tsunami. In the year 632, when the Prophet Muhammad died, Islam controlled only the Arabian Peninsula. Within 30 years, within a single generation, Muslim armies had conquered Persia, Syria, Egypt, and North Africa. They had obliterated 2 of the 3 great powers of the ancient world. The Sassanid Persian Empire simply ceased to exist. The Eastern Roman Empire, what we call Byzantium, was cut in half. By 718, the Umayyad Caliphate stretched from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the borders of India. It was the largest empire the world had seen since Alexander the Great, and it was still growing. The military machine that powered this expansion was unlike anything Europe had faced before. The Arab armies were fast, disciplined, and motivated by a religious fervor that made them fearless in battle. They traveled light, moved quickly, and struck before their enemies could organize a defense. But their greatest advantage was strategic vision. The Umayyad caliphs were not content with raiding and pillaging. They wanted permanent conquest. They built cities in the territories they captured. They established supply lines. They converted populations. They turned conquest into administration. And now, in 1718, they stood at the greatest prize of all, Constantinople. The city was more than just a capital. It was the hinge of the world. Constantinople sat at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, controlling the only sea route between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Whoever controlled Constantinople controlled trade, controlled naval power, and controlled the psychological soul of Christendom. The city had stood for nearly 400 years as the last remnant of the Roman Empire. It was the keeper of Roman law, Greek culture, and Christian faith. If it fell, the symbolic blow would be catastrophic. The Muslims knew this, the Byzantines knew this, and everyone in between knew this. For decades, the Umayyads had been probing the city's defenses. They launched raids into Anatolia, testing Byzantine response times. They captured islands in the Aegean, establishing forward bases. They studied the currents of the Bosphorus, the winds of the Marmara, and the thickness of the Theodosian walls. They were not guessing. They were planning. The man who would lead this final assault was Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik, the brother of the Umayyad Caliph and one of the finest generals in the Islamic world. Maslama was not a reckless warrior. He was a strategist. He understood logistics, engineering, and the psychology of siege warfare. He had spent years assembling the forces for this operation: 120,000 soldiers by land, 60,000 more arriving by sea, 2,600 ships carrying supplies, siege engines, and enough ambition to drown the Bosphorus. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. The fleet would blockade the city from the sea, cutting off all supply lines. The land army would surround the massive walls, preventing any relief force from breaking through. Then, slowly, methodically, they would starve Constantinople into submission. Maslama was not in a hurry. He brought enough food for his army to last 2 years. He could afford to wait. On the Byzantine side, the situation looked hopeless. The empire was a shadow of its former glory. Decades of warfare against Persia, followed by the shock of the Islamic conquests, had drained the treasury and decimated the army. Provinces that once sent tax revenue now sent refugees. The military districts of Anatolia were depopulated. The navy, once the pride of the Mediterranean, was a skeleton force. And then there was the political chaos. In 717, the Emperor Theodosius III had been overthrown by a military coup. The new ruler, Leo III, was a general from the eastern frontier. He was a military man, not a politician. He had no powerful family backing him, no ancient lineage, no claim to divine right. He had only one qualification for the throne. He was willing to do whatever it took to survive. When Leo seized power, he inherited a nightmare. The intelligence reports were clear. Maslama was coming. The invasion was imminent, and Byzantium did not have the forces to stop it in the field. The generals advised evacuation. The church leaders suggested negotiation. The aristocrats began quietly moving their wealth to safer cities in the west. But Leo refused to abandon Constantinople. He understood what the experts did not. In a siege, numbers matter less than preparation. Walls matter more than soldiers. And desperation can be a weapon if you know how to use it. Leo began preparing for a siege that would test every limit of human endurance. He ordered the grain stores filled to capacity. Every warehouse in the city became a food depot. He stripped the surrounding countryside of livestock, driving herds of cattle and sheep inside the walls before the enemy arrived. He organized the civilian population into work brigades, repairing sections of the wall that had fallen into disrepair. Most crucially, he gathered every military expert in the empire to Constantinople: engineers, artillerists, naval architects, and the masters of the most terrifying weapon in the Byzantine arsenal, Greek fire. The silence after Maslama's army appeared on the horizon was deafening. The land forces arrived first in the summer of 717. 120,000 men marched across the plains of Thrace like a plague of locusts. They were not a disorganized mob. They moved in disciplined columns, their banners snapping in the wind, their drums beating a rhythm that echoed across the fields. They set up camp in a vast semicircle around the landward walls of Constantinople, just out of catapult range. From the walls, the defenders watched in silence. There were too many to count. The Muslim army stretched from horizon to horizon, a sea of tents and cookfires that turned the night into a false dawn. The psychological impact was immediate. How do you fight an enemy that outnumbers you 3-1? How do you hold walls when the enemy has unlimited time? But Leo did not panic. He had studied the history of sieges. He knew that Constantinople had been attacked before and had always survived. The city was protected by the most formidable defensive system ever built. The Theodosian walls were not a single barrier. They were a fortress in depth. The outer wall stood 40 feet high and 15 feet thick. Behind it was a second wall, even taller. Behind that was a third. Between the walls were ditches that could be flooded, creating moats that no ladder could cross. The walls had gates, yes, but each gate was a kill box. Any attacker who broke through the first gate would find themselves trapped between walls with murder holes above them, raining down arrows, oil, and stones. The city had survived attacks by Huns, Avars, Persians, and previous Muslim sieges. The walls had never been breached by direct assault. Maslama knew this. He was not planning to storm the walls. He was planning to wait them out. His strategy depended on the naval blockade. If his fleet could cut off Constantinople from the sea, the city would eventually run out of food. The Byzantines could not feed 50,000 people on stored grain forever. Hunger would do what swords could not. In late August of 717, the Umayyad fleet appeared. It was a sight that defied description. 2,600 ships filled the Sea of Marmara like a forest of masts. Supply vessels, troop transports, warships bristling with marines. They moved in perfect formation, a display of naval power that made Byzantine scouts weep. This was not just an invasion. This was the end of the world. The fleet anchored off the coast, just outside the range of the city's defensive artillery. Their admiral, Suleiman, was a veteran of naval warfare. He had fought the Byzantines before and knew their tactics. He expected the Byzantine navy to come out and fight. He expected a glorious sea battle where his superior numbers would crush the defenders. He was wrong. Leo had no intention of fighting a conventional naval engagement. He did not have enough ships. Instead, he waited. He let the Muslim fleet settle in. He let them grow comfortable. He let them think they controlled the sea. And then, on a moonless night in early September, he unleashed hell. The Byzantine dromons, fast warships powered by oars, slipped out of the Golden Horn under cover of darkness. They were not packed with Marines for boarding actions. They were floating weapons platforms, each one equipped with a bronze tube mounted on the bow. The Muslim sentries spotted them too late. By the time the alarm was raised, the dromons were already in position. And then, the sea caught fire. Greek fire was the ultimate terror weapon of the medieval world. The exact formula was a state secret, known only to a handful of imperial technicians and guarded more closely than the crown jewels. Even today, historians are not entirely sure what it contained. The most likely ingredients were petroleum, quicklime, and sulfur, mixed into a sticky gel that ignited on contact with water. But the true genius was not the chemistry. It was the delivery system. The bronze tubes, called siphons, used compressed air to spray the burning liquid in a continuous stream. Imagine a medieval flamethrower that works on water. The mixture shot out in a jet of fire 30 feet long, sticking to everything it touched: ship hulls, sails, human flesh, and water made it burn hotter. Trying to put out Greek fire with water was like trying to put out an oil fire with gasoline. The first volley hit the Muslim flagship. The liquid splattered across the deck and erupted into green and white flames that roared into the night sky. The crew screamed and dove into the water, only to discover that the burning gel floated on the surface. Men who thought they were escaping the fire found themselves swimming through it. The screams carried across the entire fleet. Panic is contagious in naval warfare. One burning ship can terrify an entire fleet. Within minutes, the organized anchorage dissolved into chaos. Ships cut their anchor lines and tried to row away from the flames. In the darkness, they collided with each other. Some captains, desperate to escape, ordered their vessels to beach themselves on the shore. The dromons moved through the chaos like sharks, firing jet after jet of liquid fire into the packed mass of ships. By dawn, the Sea of Marmara was a graveyard. The Muslim sources admit to losing dozens of ships in that first night attack. Christian chronicles claim hundreds. The truth is probably somewhere in between. But the numbers mattered less than the psychological impact. The Umayyad fleet had been humiliated. Their vaunted naval superiority meant nothing against a weapon they could not counter. Suleiman tried to regroup. He ordered his remaining ships to disperse, to anchor far apart so a single fire attack could not spread. But this created a new problem. A dispersed fleet cannot maintain a tight blockade. Byzantine supply ships began slipping through the gaps at night, bringing grain from the Black Sea ports. The naval blockade, the cornerstone of Maslama's strategy, was failing. On land, Maslama faced his own problems. It was now September, and the autumn rains were beginning. His massive army, camped in the open fields around Constantinople, was struggling with logistics. 120,000 men need to eat. They need clean water. They need shelter. The Byzantines had stripped the countryside clean before retreating behind the walls. There was no food to forage. Every grain of wheat, every piece of meat, had to be shipped in from supply bases hundreds of miles away. And the Byzantines were not passive. Leo organized night raids. Small units of infantry would slip out through hidden gates in the walls, attack a section of the Muslim camp, kill as many men as they could, and disappear back inside before reinforcements arrived. These raids did not inflict massive casualties, but they kept the Muslim army on edge. They made sleep impossible. They turned the siege into a grinding war of attrition. Maslama sent messengers back to the caliph in Damascus. The reports were blunt. The siege was not going according to plan. The city was resisting. The navy had been mauled. Winter was coming. The caliph's response was equally blunt. Finish the job. You have unlimited resources. Take the city. So, Maslama dug in. He ordered his engineers to build permanent siege camps. Wooden palisades, supply depots, workshops for building siege engines. He was not retreating. He was settling in for a long war. If the Byzantines wanted to play the waiting game, he would wait. He had time, he had supplies, and he had faith that God was on his side. But as the first snows began to fall in late October, Maslama made a discovery that shook his confidence. He learned that the Byzantines were not just defending, they were planning. They were reaching out to allies he had not anticipated, and those allies were about to turn the siege into a nightmare. While Maslama was settling in for a winter siege, Emperor Leo was playing a different game entirely. He was not just defending Constantinople, he was building a coalition. The Byzantine Empire might be weak, but it was not isolated. Leo understood that the enemy of his enemy could become a very useful friend. And there was one power that hated the Umayyad Caliphate even more than Byzantium did: the Bulgars. The Bulgar Sanate was a relatively new power in the Balkans. They were a Turkic nomadic people who had migrated from the steppes and established control over the lands north of Constantinople. They were fierce warriors, expert horsemen, and they had no love for the Muslims. The Umayyad expansion had pushed north into their sphere of influence. Maslama's army had marched through Bulgar territory to reach Constantinople without asking permission. This was an insult that demanded blood. Leo sent ambassadors to Khan Tervel, the Bulgar ruler. The message was simple: the Muslims are camped at our gates. If we fall, you are next. Help us destroy them now, while they are vulnerable, and we will reward you with gold, territory, and eternal friendship. Tervel did not need much convincing. He had been looking for an excuse to test his army against the Umayyads. In November of 717, as winter set in, Tervel struck. 20,000 Bulgar cavalry appeared without warning on the northern flank of Maslama's siege lines. They did not come to hold territory. They came to kill. The Bulgar cavalry charge was a thing of brutal efficiency. They were light horsemen, armed with composite bows and sabers, and they moved with a speed that shocked the Muslim forces. The northern section of Maslama's camp was not prepared for a cavalry assault. The soldiers were focused on the city walls to their south. They had sentries watching for Byzantine sorties, not for an attack from behind. When the Bulgars hit them, the result was a massacre. Entire units were overrun before they could form defensive lines. Supply wagons were burned. Thousands of men died in the initial assault. Maslama reacted quickly. He pulled troops from the siege lines and marched north to engage the Bulgars. But Tervel had no intention of fighting a pitched battle against superior numbers. As soon as the Muslim heavy infantry arrived, the Bulgars melted away, disappearing into the forests and hills. They were nomads. Hit-and-run warfare was their specialty. For the next 3 months, the Bulgars turned Maslama's supply lines into a nightmare. Every convoy traveling from the coast to the siege camps was vulnerable. Every foraging party sent out to find food risked annihilation. The Muslims were forced to travel in massive armed columns, which slowed everything down. Food that should have taken days to transport took weeks, and all the while, winter was getting worse. The winter of 717 to 718 was one of the coldest on record in the Balkans. Snow fell in thick blankets, burying the Muslim camps. The soldiers, many of them from Arabia and North Africa, had never experienced cold like this. They were not equipped for it. Their tents were designed for desert heat, not freezing winds. Frostbite became epidemic. Men who survived battles died in their sleep from hypothermia. The cold also killed the horses. The Muslim army relied heavily on cavalry, but horses need fodder. There was no grass growing in the frozen fields. The grain that should have fed the horses was being diverted to feed the soldiers. Thousands of horses starved to death or were slaughtered for meat. By January, Maslama's cavalry was effectively crippled. Inside Constantinople, the situation was not comfortable, but it was manageable. Leo had prepared well. The granaries were full. The population was on strict rationing, but no one was starving. The walls provided shelter from the wind, and morale was rising. Every day that the city held out was a victory. Every report of Muslim suffering was celebrated in the churches. The Byzantine defenders began to taunt the besiegers. They would stand on the walls and shout insults across the frozen fields. They threw scraps of food over the walls, mocking the hungry soldiers below. It was psychological warfare at its finest. The Muslims had come to conquer the greatest city in Christendom, and instead, they were freezing to death in the mud. But Maslama was not ready to give up. He sent urgent messages to Damascus demanding reinforcements and supplies. The Caliph, Umar II, responded by sending another fleet in the spring of 718, 400 fresh ships loaded with grain, weapons, and 20,000 additional soldiers. This second fleet was supposed to break the stalemate. It was supposed to restore the naval blockade and finally starve Constantinople into submission. It never arrived. The Second Umayyad fleet, under the command of a different admiral, made a catastrophic error. Many of the crew members were not Arab Muslims. They were Christian conscripts from Egypt and Syria, men who had been forced into service. These conscripts had no love for the Umayyad cause. They were fighting for an empire that had conquered their homelands. As the fleet approached Constantinople in April of 718, something extraordinary happened. The Christian crews mutinied. They overpowered their Muslim officers, took control of the ships, and sailed directly to Constantinople. They surrendered the entire fleet to Emperor Leo. 400 ships, 20,000 men, mountains of supplies, all handed over without a fight. The defection was a disaster for the Umayyad war effort. Not only did they lose the reinforcements, but Leo now had 400 additional ships to defend the city. The naval balance shifted overnight. The Byzantines went from being outnumbered at sea to having numerical parity. Leo did not waste the opportunity. He used the captured ships to launch aggressive raids against the Muslim positions. The Dromons, reinforced with fresh vessels, began hunting down the remaining Umayyad fleet. More Greek fire attacks lit up the Marmara. More ships burned. More crews died screaming in the water. By May of 718, Maslama's position was untenable. He had lost half his fleet. His army was starving. The Bulgars were still raiding his supply lines. And worst of all, the Byzantines were not weakening. They were getting stronger. Every day more reinforcements slipped into the city by sea. Food supplies were flowing in from the Black Sea. The siege, which was supposed to strangle Constantinople, had become a death trap for the besiegers. But Maslama was a stubborn man. He refused to retreat. He convinced himself that one more push, one more assault, might break the Byzantine defenses. In June, he ordered a direct attack on the walls. The assault on the Theodosian walls in June of 718 was an act of desperation disguised as determination. Maslama knew his position was collapsing. He had lost the naval war. He had lost the logistics war. He had lost the weather war, but he had not yet tried to take the walls by storm. Perhaps, he reasoned, a sudden overwhelming assault could succeed where patience had failed. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Maslama ordered his siege engines brought forward, massive wooden towers on wheels, tall enough to overlook the outer walls, battering rams covered in wet hides to protect them from fire, scaling ladders by the hundreds. He assembled assault columns of his best troops, men who had survived the winter and were hungry for revenge. The plan was to hit multiple sections of the wall simultaneously, overwhelming the defenders through sheer numbers. The Byzantines watched the preparations with grim satisfaction. Leo had been waiting for this moment. A siege is a static affair, but an assault is an opportunity. When the enemy comes to you, you can kill him efficiently. The defenders prepared their own surprises. Cauldrons of boiling oil were heated over fires. Stones were piled next to the ramparts. Crossbows were loaded, and the artillery crews calibrated their machines. Byzantine artillery was sophisticated for its time. They used torsion-powered catapults that could hurl stones weighing hundreds of pounds. They had ballistae, giant crossbows that fired iron-tipped bolts capable of punching through shields and armor. And they had something the Muslims did not: mathematics. Byzantine engineers had studied the science of trajectories. They knew exactly how far their machines could throw. They had pre-sighted every field of fire. When the Muslim assault began, it started with a bombardment. Umayyad catapults launched stones at the walls, trying to suppress the defenders. But the Theodosian walls were built to absorb punishment. The outer wall was 15 feet thick of solid stone and brick. A catapult stone would hit, chip off some masonry, and bounce off. You could pound the walls for days without making a breach. Then the siege towers began to roll forward. These were massive structures, 3 or 4 stories tall, pushed by dozens of men. They were supposed to bridge the gap between the ground and the top of the walls, allowing assault troops to pour onto the ramparts. But moving a wooden tower across broken ground is harder than it sounds. The Byzantines had not left the approaches to the walls flat and smooth. There were ditches, there were hidden pits, there were obstacles. As the first tower approached the outer wall, it began to tilt. The wheels on one side sank into soft ground. The entire structure leaned dangerously. The men inside scrambled to stabilize it, but Byzantine artillery crews were already targeting it. A massive stone launched from a catapult hit the tower at mid-height. The impact splintered the wooden frame. The tower collapsed sideways, spilling screaming men onto the ground. The troops inside the collapsed tower became easy targets. Byzantine archers on the walls had been waiting for this. Crossbow bolts rained down on the struggling soldiers. Men who tried to crawl away from the wreckage were pinned to the earth by iron-tipped shafts. It was a massacre. Other towers fared no better. One was set on fire by Byzantine incendiary pots, clay vessels filled with a flammable mixture that shattered on impact. The wooden structure burned like a torch. Another tower actually reached the wall, but discovered a new horror. The defenders had poured oil on the ramparts and set it alight. The assault troops trying to cross from the tower onto the walls found themselves walking through flames. The battering rams were equally unsuccessful. To use a battering ram, you have to get close to the gate, but the approaches to the gates were kill zones. The Byzantines had designed them that way: narrow passages, right angles that slowed down any charge, and murder holes in the ceiling. As the ram crews struggled to position their weapon against the gate, defenders above them dropped stones, boiling oil, and anything else heavy enough to kill. One ram crew made it all the way to the gate and began pounding. The rhythmic boom of wood on iron echoed across the battlefield. For a moment, it seemed like they might succeed. But the gate was not just wood. It was wood reinforced with iron bands, backed by massive stones. And while the crew was focused on their task, Byzantine engineers dropped something through a murder hole. A clay pot filled with Greek fire. The pot shattered on the ram. The liquid fire engulfed the battering ram and the men around it. The screams were horrible. Men covered in burning gel ran in circles, spreading the fire to anyone they touched. Their comrades could not help them. Throwing water on Greek fire made it burn hotter. The only thing you could do was smother the flames with sand or dirt. But in the chaos of battle, there was no sand. The final element of Maslama's assault was the scaling ladders. Thousands of soldiers rushed the walls carrying long wooden ladders, trying to swarm the ramparts through sheer numbers. This was the oldest siege tactic in history, and the Byzantines had been defending against it for centuries. As the ladders went up against the walls, the defenders simply pushed them away. A ladder leaning against a wall is unstable. One man with a pole can topple it, and when a ladder falls, everyone on it falls too. Byzantine soldiers used long forked poles to hook the top of the ladders and shove them backward. The Muslims climbing up had no warning. One moment, they were ascending. The next, they were falling through the air. Some ladders were not pushed away, but were instead targeted with fire. Defenders dropped burning bundles of straw onto the ladders, setting them alight while men were still climbing. Other ladders were attacked with concentrated crossbow fire. The men at the top of the ladder, the bravest ones who climbed first, were shot at point-blank range. A few attackers did manage to reach the top of the wall. These were desperate, courageous men who made it through the fire and arrows. But reaching the rampart was not the same as taking it. Byzantine defenders met them with swords, spears, and axes. Hand-to-hand combat on a narrow wall favors the defender. You cannot bring numbers to bear. It becomes a series of individual duels, and the Byzantines were fighting for their homes. The assault lasted all day. Wave after wave of Muslim soldiers threw themselves at the walls, and wave after wave was thrown back. By evening, the ground in front of the Theodosian walls was carpeted with bodies. The wounded crawled back toward the Muslim lines, leaving trails of blood in the dirt. The dead were piled so thick in some places that they formed obstacles. Maslama watched the slaughter from his command post. He had committed thousands of his best troops to the assault, and he had nothing to show for it. The walls were undamaged, the gates were intact, and his army was bleeding to death. That night, he called a council of war with his commanders. The mood was grim. One general reported that they had lost perhaps 10,000 men in the assault. Another reported that food supplies were critically low. The grain from the captured Second Fleet had never reached them, and the Bulgars had intercepted the last supply convoy from the coast. A third general stated the obvious. They could not take the city by storm. The walls were too strong. Maslama made the hardest decision of his military career. He ordered the retreat. After nearly a year of siege, after losing tens of thousands of men, after committing the largest invasion force in Umayyad history, he was giving up. The retreat order went out in early August of 718, almost exactly 1 year after the siege had begun. But retreating from Constantinople was almost as dangerous as attacking it. Maslama's army was weakened, demoralized, and had to march hundreds of miles through hostile territory. The Bulgars were waiting. The retreat from Constantinople was not a withdrawal. It was a rout. Maslama tried to maintain order, tried to keep his units together in organized columns, but discipline was breaking down. The soldiers knew the siege had failed. They knew they were abandoning their dead comrades. And they knew that the road home was lined with enemies. The Bulgar cavalry had been tracking the Muslim army for months, waiting for exactly this moment. A retreating army is vulnerable. It is stretched out in a long column. It is focused on moving, not fighting, and it is psychologically defeated. Tervel's horsemen struck the rear guard first, the tired, wounded men, who marched at the back of the column. The attacks followed a brutal pattern. The Bulgars would appear suddenly from the forests or hills, charge into the Muslim column, kill as many men as they could in a few minutes, and then vanish before a counterattack could be organized. They were not trying to destroy the entire army. They were bleeding it slowly, taking a few hundred lives at a time. Each attack forced Maslama to stop the march and deploy his troops in defensive formation. But every stop cost time. Every delay meant his army had to spend another night in hostile territory. And every night, more men died, some from Bulgar raids, some from disease, some simply deserted, slipping away in the darkness to try to make it home on their own. The Muslim sources from this period are fragmentary and often contradictory, but they all agree on one thing: the retreat was a catastrophe. One chronicler describes the road from Constantinople to the coast as lined with corpses. Another speaks of entire units that left the city and never made it home. The numbers are debated, but modern historians estimate that Maslama lost at least 30,000 men during the retreat. Combined with the losses during the siege itself, the total death toll for the campaign was staggering. By the time the survivors reached the coast and boarded ships to cross back to Muslim-controlled territory, the great army that had set out to conquer Constantinople had been reduced to a fraction of its original size. Of the 180,000 men who participated in the siege, perhaps fewer than 100,000 made it home. Tens of thousands had died, others had defected, some had been captured and sold into slavery. The naval losses were equally devastating. Of the original 2,600 ships, the Umayyad fleet had lost somewhere between 400 and 600 vessels. Some burned by Greek fire, some captured, some wrecked in storms. It was the greatest naval disaster in Umayyad history. When Maslama finally stood before the caliph in Damascus to report the failure, the political consequences were immediate. The Umayyad Caliphate had staked its prestige on this campaign. The caliph had declared that Constantinople would fall, that the road to Rome would be opened, that Christendom would be shattered. Instead, the Muslims had suffered a humiliating defeat. The failure at Constantinople marked a turning point in the expansion of Islam. For a century, the Muslim armies had seemed unstoppable. They had conquered with such speed and such success that it appeared God truly was on their side. But Constantinople had stopped them cold. It proved that the Byzantines, even weakened and diminished, could still defend their heartland. It proved that Greek fire was a weapon that could negate numerical superiority. And it proved that walls, properly defended, were stronger than armies. The psychological impact rippled across the medieval world. In the Christian kingdoms of Europe, the news of Constantinople's survival was received with relief and celebration. Church bells rang from Rome to Paris. The Byzantines had held the line. They had stopped the Islamic tide at the gates of Europe. It was not quite the same as Charles Martel's victory at Tours 14 years later, but it was just as important. For Emperor Leo III, the victory cemented his political power. He had been a usurper, a general who seized the throne through military coup. But now he was the savior of Constantinople. He was the emperor who had faced down the greatest invasion in history and emerged victorious. His legitimacy was no longer in question. He would rule for another 23 years, becoming one of the most consequential Byzantine emperors of the medieval period. Leo used his newfound authority to reform the empire. He reorganized the military districts, creating a more efficient defensive system. He rebuilt the navy, expanding the production of Greek fire and the construction of dromons. He strengthened the walls of Constantinople, repairing damage and adding new fortifications. And controversially, he launched the iconoclast movement, banning religious icons in an effort to purify Byzantine Christianity. This last policy would tear the empire apart for generations, but it showed Leo's willingness to make radical changes. The Umayyad Caliphate, meanwhile, entered a period of internal crisis. The failure at Constantinople damaged the prestige of the ruling dynasty. Regional governors began to question orders from Damascus. The empire was still vast and powerful, but the aura of invincibility was gone. Within 30 years, the Umayyad dynasty would be overthrown in a violent revolution, replaced by the Abbasid Caliphate. The defeat at Constantinople did not cause this collapse, but it contributed to the sense that the Umayyads had lost the mandate of heaven. The military lessons of the siege were studied for centuries. Byzantine defensive doctrine became the model for medieval siege warfare. The use of Greek fire remained a closely guarded secret, but its existence forced every naval power in the Mediterranean to rethink their tactics. You could not blockade Constantinople by sea as long as the Byzantines had Greek fire. Any attempt to do so would result in burning ships and drowned sailors. The siege also demonstrated the importance of coalition warfare. Leo's alliance with the Bulgars had been crucial. The Bulgar cavalry raids disrupted Umayyad logistics and prevented Maslama from concentrating all his forces on the city. This lesson would be repeated throughout military history. A besieged fortress with active allies in the field is far harder to reduce than one fighting alone. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the siege was psychological. Constantinople became a symbol. It was the city that could not be conquered. For the next 700 years, Muslim armies would dream of taking Constantinople, but none would succeed. The city would finally fall in 1453 to the Ottoman Turks, but that conquest came through artillery and new siege technology that the Umayyads of 718 could not have imagined. The defenders of 718 had bought Byzantium another 7 centuries of life. They had preserved Greek and Roman culture during the darkest period of the Dark Ages. They had kept the flame of classical civilization alive, while Western Europe was fragmented and illiterate, and they had done it with walls, fire, and an emperor who refused to surrender. Standing on the walls of modern Istanbul, you can still see the remnants of the Theodosian walls. They are crumbling now, overtaken by urban sprawl, but sections remain intact. If you walk along them and close your eyes, you can almost hear the echoes, the roar of Greek fire igniting, the screams of burning sailors, the crash of siege towers collapsing, the defiant shouts of defenders who refused to let their city die. The Battle of Constantinople in 718 was not a single afternoon of combat. It was a year-long siege that became a test of endurance, ingenuity, and will. It was a confrontation between the largest invasion force the medieval world had ever seen, and a city that had stood for 400 years and refused to fall. The Umayyads came to Constantinople with 2,600 ships and 180,000 men. They came with the confidence of conquerors who had never been stopped. They came believing that God had promised them victory. They left in scattered, broken columns, haunted by the memory of liquid fire and impregnable walls. They left having learned that some cities, some peoples, cannot be conquered. They can only be survived, and Constantinople survived. It survived because Emperor Leo prepared. It survived because Byzantine engineers had perfected Greek fire. It survived because the Bulgars struck at the perfect moment. It survived because 50,000 defenders believed that their walls were stronger than 180,000 attackers. They were right. In the grand sweep of European military history, the siege of Constantinople in 718 stands as one of the most consequential defensive victories ever achieved. It was the moment when the seemingly unstoppable expansion of Islam crashed against a wall it could not break. It was the moment when Byzantium proved that the Roman Empire, however diminished, was not yet ready to die. And it was the moment when the medieval world learned that the deadliest weapon on a battlefield is not always the sword or the spear. Sometimes it is simply the refusal to surrender. The soldiers who stood on those walls in 718 did not know they were changing the course of history. They were simply defending their homes. They were protecting their families. They were fighting because the alternative was unthinkable. But in doing so, they gave Europe time to recover, time to organize, time to build the kingdoms and cultures that would eventually push back against Islamic expansion. Without the victory at Constantinople, there might have been no Charlemagne, no Holy Roman Empire, no Renaissance. The cultural and religious map of Europe would have been fundamentally different. The defenders of Constantinople in 718 were not just protecting a city, they were protecting a civilization. So, when we ask what made Muslim warriors terrified of Byzantine counter-siege tactics, the answer is simple: Greek fire, the Theodosian walls, and an emperor who understood that in a siege, victory belongs not to the largest army, but to the one willing to endure the longest. Maslama had time, numbers, and confidence. Leo had walls, fire, and desperation. In the end, desperation proved stronger than confidence. Walls proved stronger than numbers, and fire proved deadlier than swords. The siege of Constantinople in 718 was not just a battle, it was a statement, a declaration that Europe would not fall without a fight, that Christianity would not be erased without resistance, and that some walls, some cities, and some peoples are simply too stubborn to conquer. The Umayyads learned this lesson in the most brutal way possible. They learned it in the flames of Greek fire. They learned it in the frozen fields outside the Theodosian walls. and they learned it in the long, bloody retreat that turned their greatest invasion into their worst disaster. History is full of sieges. Most are forgotten. But the siege of Constantinople in 718 echoes through the centuries because it changed everything. It stopped an empire that had conquered half the world. It saved a city that would stand for 7 more centuries. And it proved that the course of human events can turn on a single refusal to give up. Leo III stood on the walls of Constantinople and said no. That single word, backed by Greek fire and Byzantine steel, was enough to break an empire and save a civilization. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the forgotten siege that saved Europe. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Battle of Constantinople and the weapon that terrified an empire, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel survive the algorithm. Make sure you are subscribed and have the bell notification turned on so you do not miss our next documentary. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think Greek fire was the deadliest weapon of the medieval world? Could any army have broken the Theodosian walls? Let the debate begin below. Until next time, remember that history is not just about what happened. It is about who refused to surrender when surrender seemed inevitable.